So let's get to our interview with Elle Jones. She's going to be joining the program right now. Elle Jones is a poet, a journalist, a professor, and community activist in Halifax. She's a contributor to The Breach, and she just recently wrote an incisive piece called Beware, the Neoliberal Co-optation of Black Lives Matter. Thanks for joining the broadcast. We're happy to have you. I guess just to start off, how are you feeling now on election night?
Oh, I mean, this is the fraught for people, especially like me who work on deportations and prisons. This is where it really feels like the moment is, right? A conservative government is absolutely devastating for what it is that we're working on. Of course, here in Nova Scotia, we saw a provincial government go conservative, and many of us interpreted that as a kind of white lash, a backlash to Black Lives Matter, to Indigenous rights. There was a very distinct geographical element to that, that the rural regions went conservative, Halifax stayed NDP, and then there was a kind of loss of the Liberal seats. And some of the things that happened provincially, which I think give a bit of an idea of what we might be in for expecting. We saw, for example, a white Minister of African Nova Scotian Affairs installed in Nova Scotia. And so the Black community has been quite alarmed about what went there. But of course, federally, it's even more alarming. I'm in contact with many, many people from prisons who, of course, organize entirely to vote Liberal. It's kind of funny because we might vote NDP, we would, but, we have to vote Liberal because we just don't want conservatives. And they actually do mass election organizing. The committees go around, they kind of push everybody to vote. Of course, they vote in their home ridings, not in their prison riding. And I know they're very concerned because they always say if it's conservative, it's all over. We lose our visiting, we lose so many different rights. That has a real material effect. So this is life and death for a lot of people facing deportations, people living in confinement. And so, I don't know what to expect, but, that our lives in the balance here. So
yeah, well, it seems like this is the kind of storyline every one of these elections is people end up falling into this kind of framing.
Yeah, of course, yeah, I'm not exactly, I think, of course, the idea that our democracy hinges solely and only on elections is entirely destructive. And obviously, particularly for Black people who never get anything, it doesn't matter. We get some money for entrepreneurship, so there's definitely that class piece as well, where what has been happening with the Liberal government is, while they have not taken any care of actual things like prisons, they haven't changed anything like status for all. They certainly haven't made progress on things like deportation. But what they have done is scattered some token cash among elite Black people in order to buy us off and bring us into the fold. And I can't ignore that that's also one of the reasons why provincially Black people started gnashing their teeth, like the Black elite, because they literally give us money to fund our organizations to essentially stop grassroots organizing. So I certainly don't want to suggest that, I'm here we must have a Liberal government. Yeah. But of course, a conservative government is always perhaps even more of a problem. Everything's but the conservatives.
This is the problem with these elections. It's like we're faced with this choice of all these serious issues not being addressed properly, or if going in the exact opposite direction. So it's the choice that we're always faced with. And that's the thing. A common theme that has come up tonight already, and I think overall in this election, is these very serious issues, issues facing unhoused folks, incarcerated people, racialized people. How is this election? How has it been for these kind of groups, which I know you do a lot of organizing with, and do you think these issues are being treated seriously enough? Not just by the Liberals and the Conservatives, but by for instance, the NDP, who should sort of be offering that kind of alternative for these communities.
Well, again, I don't want to sound fully invested into these parties, the election system, but we did actually have, so after a provincial election, to go back to that, the next day was when they did evictions on shelters. So we had an election. The very next day, the police showed up at shelters at 5:30, 6:30 a.m. to evict people. And we had an extremely violent eviction, much like you've seen in Toronto. And in fact, for the previous month, I've been engaged in that work, trying to get unhoused people connected, supporting people. It's been really 24 hours a day work that's been exhausting. And of course, how does voting change that? And the NDP actually was quite active. They showed up that day. They have come by. We have a park where unhoused people have congregated, and they have showed up. So as far as these things go, it has seemed like there's at least been some interest in it. But everything that we're facing is decades in the making, and every election kicks it further down the road, right?
Yeah.
When Trudeau came in, he said in 2015 he was going to address parole, he was going to address these things. Those serious reforms haven't been done, and I haven't particularly seen Jagmeet Singh step up on those matters either. We haven't seen a strong Black platform from the NDP. In fact, at one point, I wrote them when I was quite alarmed about the Liberal government essentially buying our vote and said, you guys really need a Black platform. You should work with people. They still haven't really done that and worked on a Black specific platform. So for Black people in particular, we are perceived as poor and powerless. We're not perceived as a strong voting bloc. We're perceived of having to be grateful for what we get. And again, like scatterings of offerings to certain neoliberals who will sit at the table in proximity to white power, and their job is to essentially sell that back to us as progress. But what we don't see is anything real in terms of people taking seriously migrant workers, people taking seriously land house, taking seriously criminalization, serious things about prison. I mean, we have, an Office of Public Safety and a Minister of Public Safety, which is more or less dedicated to anti-Blackness. We might as well just call it the Minister of Anti-Blackness. It's guns, drugs, borders. These are all the things essentially to police us. And nobody takes that seriously. We have no serious anti-war discourse. It never even makes the debates. We don't talk about the military. We don't talk about military funding. We certainly don't talk about Canada's activities in Africa, what we did in Haiti. Like, that foreign policy is nowhere to be found. And that directly impacts Black people, as well as, of course, refugees, migrants. So there's never any full discourse that really helpful to us to engage in. And as you said, we get continually trapped in lesser evil discourse. Well, it's as good as you can get discourse. And for our community, of course, it is extremely difficult to organize when we're always on the knife edge of, facing disaster, trying to pay our bills. People don't actually have the time to do the long-term sustained organizing, not just hitting the streets for BLM protests, not just the summer of George Floyd, but organizing even about, if we care about elections, even doing that pre-election work is very, very difficult. So we have strategically and deliberately lost our power to organize as Black people. I think of Black United Front in Halifax in the 70s, organized by Rocky Jones and others, where their goal was to create a political force among Black people. They looked at what happened in Africville, and they said, so this is the, obviously, eviction of Africville, the clearance of Africville. And they understood that we needed a political organ in order to effectively stand up to the state, and tried to create the Black United Front, which is immediately co-opted by forces inside the community and immediately appropriated by government. And that eventually led to the creation of many of these government organizations that we now have, scattered in our community, that are deliberately imposed, one, to prevent grassroots activity, and two, to really I would say that they're to also, from grassroots organizing, and then also really prevented for us to have this kind of access to our own government. And we have continued to live that out. So that has been a continual problem that we've really been living, and also to turn us into social workers and not political actors, right? So we are very much encouraged to do this sort of crisis social work with each other, which is necessary, responding to the prison call, trying to get people into shelter. These are things we end up doing, but what we don't end up having the time to do is organizing more broadly and politically. We still don't have a Black political organ in this country. We don't have any sort of political voice. We don't organize in that way. We don't have there wouldn't be a newspaper now, but you know what I mean? Like, these are things that we actually lack that make effective organizing nationally extremely difficult, especially when we have a complex community. It's not one group of people. We're migrants, we're immigrants, we're middle-class immigrants, we're, people living in, we have a whole range that we need to somehow manage to organize and not just mobilize. And that has been very difficult, deliberately so, by decades of government policy to prevent that political power. And then we live that out on nights like tonight, where it's just like, well, just vote Liberal and maybe they'll scatter some cash at us.
Yeah. Well, I certainly understand and empathize with your position that it is somewhat painful to have to break everything down through this electoral lens. One thing I try to tell myself, though, is that these election seasons do kind of bring a bunch of people, or a lot of new people, into the political process that start paying attention to these issues that maybe they wouldn't be paying attention to throughout the rest of the year, when these elections aren't going on. So even if we do agree that a lot of these serious issues aren't really being addressed electorally, it does provide us, I think, an opportunity to speak to these issues and speak to sort of a new group of people that maybe aren't as plugged in, at other times, right?
Yeah, and it also reveals a lot about our national narratives. I mean, perhaps we can be instructed in other ways, but one thinks, of course, of all the major parties writing to the media and complaining that, people described, the bill in Quebec as discriminatory, right? Yeah. So we're not going to complain that it's actually discriminatory. We're just going to complain about using the word discriminatory. And of course, that's just about coddling voters in Quebec, right? That, oh no, if we suggest that this is somehow racist or xenophobic, then Quebec won't vote for us. And so we always have these particular discourses on race. Last election, it was, of course, blackface, but then that somewhat extinguished itself by the time the actual election. I always go back to the fact that CBC did not have a single black voice the entire election night. And I was, in fact, invited among other people. It's not that they didn't invite any black people, to be clear. They just simply didn't put any black people on the actual air. And the reading of that was, when it was briefly blackface, black people were relevant, and we better have some black people on the news, and we were all on the news. But by the time it was 3 weeks, 4 weeks later, or whatever it was, and the election was, we're not seen as actually having discourse on things like the economy, childcare. We're all seen as just an extra. Well, childcare will be good for you too, but not that we would be central to that. Certainly, we are never seen as having a voice on foreign policy. We couldn't have thoughts on China. We couldn't have, so we're always confined to a series of issues that are seen as our issues: justice, poverty stuff. That's about it. That's what we get. And then we are literally exited from the political landscape while discussions go on around us, and then nobody mentions the word race on election night, right? They will talk about the West and, the Western conservative, and never mention race in that entire landscape. And so that is always instructive in that sense too, right? Like how we build these national narratives, what we're telling ourselves, how we speak, and of course how little Canada is willing to confront colonialism and race, and certainly not on election night. Even if, say, CBC as a public broadcaster will at other times discuss Indigenous issues or whatever, they don't necessarily see election night as a place to really get into that. And you'll have always one rogue commentator who manages to, squeeze these issues in. So it always shows you as well, of course, Canada's set colonial narratives around what really matters, who's really a citizen. And this becomes ongoing and installed through this process. So I don't mean to sound entirely cynical. I'm just saying, this is what we're facing, right?
I understand the cynicism, believe me. I think everyone watching probably understands that cynicism. I wanted to ask you, while we still have you as well, about this case of the high-profile former Liberal Selena Cesar-Chavanes, who left the Liberal government, accusing it of tokenism, and is now throwing her support to the Conservatives in this election. What did you make of that?
Well, I want to go back to when we were fighting the deportation of Abdul Abdi in 2018, which was, for a period of time, the #1 national story. This was a huge story. So this was a Somali youth who, along with his sister, was brought to my province, Nova Scotia, and they were taken into the foster care system. They did not get citizenship, and then Abdul was facing deportation. And there was a massive national movement to fight that. I raised that because not a single member of the Black Caucus would even tweet for us, and I include MP Selena Chavanes in that. We couldn't even get them to send a tweet, never mind to stand up in Parliament. And then we hear about how these Black politicians are doing so much for us, and they fought justice and they've done these things, and I can't see the evidence of any of that. In fact, all I've ever seen them do is come out and defend blackface, as all of them did, when they were summoned, stand on stage when we recognize a decade of people of African descent 3 years too late. These are the kind of things we get. So what's interesting about former MP Selena Chavanes is she has kind of reworked herself post being in office as a progressive, which I don't think actually met her legislative record. It's hard to point to anything she actually did in Parliament to advance these issues. And no one ever questions that, right? We're not actually ever, whenever you see an interview, no one ever actually says, can you show me what you actually did? We just accept this. So I say this to say it is less surprising than we're perhaps supposed to see it. And we, of course, know that her narrative, we know her narrative with Trudeau. We know that obviously that was personally painful. I don't discount, I'm not surprised by that. In fact, it's not like we weren't saying Trudeau wasn't SH since 2015, so it's like when everybody else realized it, it's not like they came back to those of us that said that and admitted we were right. While we're fighting Trudeau on a deportation, they certainly didn't support us on that and understand that Trudeau actually didn't help Black people. Then when they have a personal experience, Trudeau's nothing. And I'm like, yeah, but he always was. So I don't know why you're just discovering this. And then, of course, it becomes a personal sort of, now I'm going to vote Conservative. So, I'm not only voting Conservative, but wearing blue. So,
yeah,
I can't begin to interpret her actions. I can interpret them through the lens of personal feeling. I don't know if it was about getting in the media, needing to sort of escalate in order to be able to respond to the debate. I think she wanted to do that. I don't know her personally, so I can't speak on that. It certainly was a miscalculation if she's trying to speak to Black people. Black people who haven't been particularly critical of any of our public figures for various reasons to do with, histories of white supremacy, our reluctance to call each other out in public, all of those things. Certainly, I saw as much backlash as you would ever expect to see on a prominent Black public figure for that. Somebody said, I regret every second I spent sending out flyers for you, like this kind of thing. But I also think that in that sense, it's also misguided and that is our only place for criticism. So now people will say, oh my God, I can't believe she did that. But nobody will recognize that not just her, and I won't single her out here, that the Black caucus has never been responsive to us. So I can cite Abdul, I can also cite prisons, I can cite so many things where you've had a completely non-responsive Black caucus who sets themselves up as our voice, but then is too scared or doesn't want to, or doesn't see it as politically expedient to actually serve us, to actually take a stance for us. We're supposed to hold them up as leaders and then get shocked when they turn out to be self-interested. I'm like, they're all self-interested. She is no different. I'm not going to single her out as worse. I mean, Anna May Paul has, used racism and sexism, and said, oh, this is all racist and sexist while denying her own treatment of Palestinians, right? Like this is happening. I don't want to single out Black women, because I'm a Black woman, it also matters to me more, but let us acknowledge that racism and sexism is always alive and present for Black women. I will never discount its presence. I will never discount the trauma that Black women go through. And I will never say that Black women deserve more criticism for their actions than, the many, many awful and terrible actions taken by white people all over the place that skate. So I'm only saying this as a Black person. I do also think, though, that we have to have that discourse as well in our community. And that is to do with, I think, how politicians have become celebrities, how they become public figures, how they, there's now an idea, I think, that running for office is getting you attention. It's about all these other things. And what it is not about is actually taking a stand to serve the grassroots. And that is present throughout. So I suppose this is where people then say, you're so critical of the elite, you're poisonous. You get people very upset with this idea that you criticize these respectable, titled people. But this is a legacy of a long history of when we were politically disempowered and had to rely on a few figures. And it is 2021. And as Black people, we are going to have to learn that having a minister of immigration who deports Black people is not liberation. Having a Black prime minister, if we got one, would not signal liberation. We all learned that with Obama. So this is also our problem, that not just the general investment in the electoral system, but on top of that, we have an investment in having made it, having a voice at the table, finally being, able to participate in this capitalist patriarchal system in some kind of full way. And those are very powerful narratives. And then when those individuals cannot stand up for those narratives, that, MP Selena is not perfect, right? Like, she's not actually a Black hero. She's not actually a grassroots figure. She's no worse than anybody else. But yes, that move to the Conservatives, I think, perhaps said something about how little politics have become about policy, how little they become about principle, and how much they are about battles of character, who's mean to who looks this way, who does that, identity, all of these other things, except for what you actually do when you're present. So a couple of weeks ago on Dr. Vibe Black Talk, we had a pretty heated discussion about this. So if people are more interested in how some of the Black community, obviously we don't represent the entire community in any way, but many Black commenters were speaking on that issue at that point. So people can find that from the Dr. Vibe show, Talking Black. It would have been right after it happened, so the Sunday after she announced that. So I encourage people to look at that for a more fulsome discussion.
Yeah, I agree with that. And thank you so much, Elle, for joining the broadcast. It was great to speak to you about these issues. Thanks for joining you. We'll have to do it again on the next broadcast we do.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, that was great. Riley, that was a really great talk with Elle Jones. Did anything stand out to you from what we just heard from Elle?
Yeah, I really appreciated all of Elle's experience and the insight she can offer us in terms of organizing under different governments, how different marginalized communities have been experiencing election season as well. I also really appreciated her critique, which I've been also just so frustrated with this election about Canada's lack of any conversation around foreign affairs.
Yes.
You know, when we tried to have like during the debate, I'm thinking we tried to have a mini conversation about Afghanistan, and it was just like, how sad is that? Wow.
Yeah.
And then
We didn't do enough imperialism. in that case.
Yeah, exactly. The re-narration and just like the reassertion of these lies about Canada during the election has been so painful to watch, and I think speaks
Yes.
a lot to what Elle was saying.